Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. In this episode, we're going to answer all of your questions. During Ramadan, we received a lot of questions and we weren't able to answer them. So here it is now, Dr. Shabir, a special episode with just people's questions.
Yeah.
So here's a question from a viewer. As a Sunni Muslim, I've always learned that Sunnis have 4 branches: Hanafi, Hanbali, Shafi'i, and Maliki. Where does Wahhabism and Salafism come from? And are they actually part of Sunni Islam or recognized by the Hanafi, Hanbali, Shafi'i, Maliki school to be part of Sunni Islam? What is the Aqeedah of Wahhabism and Salafism? It's a very good question.
Okay, perhaps a good place to start is with the term Salafi, not as a technical term referring to a particular, say, following or trend within the Muslim faith, as known today, as a particular distinctive movement. But let's think of just the idea of Salafis.
It's an Arabic term.
Yeah, it's an Arabic term. And Salaf in Arabic means like those who have gone before. So Salafi means one who is connected to that, or one who is looking forward to that kind of faith and practice that was known in the earliest generations of Islam. It's almost like our Christian friends say, they want the apostolic faith.
Mm-hmm.
So, they want the faith that is connected to the apostles of Jesus, those whom Jesus had sent out himself, or the disciples of Jesus. So in a similar way, among Muslims, there is the idea that we want to get that original faith from the earliest generation. So that in a broad way means a kind of Salafi type of following. We want to follow the Salaf.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do Muslims generally try to follow the Salaf? Well, the questioner mentioned the 4 schools of Islamic jurisprudence. And those 4 schools go back, the eponyms of those 4 schools were persons who lived in the 2nd century of Islam. So Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi, and Ahmad bin Hanbal.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is very early. There are people earlier than them, but these came to be known for their systematic thinking and, of course, the proliferation of their teachings through their many students who were naturally schooled well, and then they taught others. So these became major trends and streams and branches within, or you can say, currents within Muslim thinking and practice.
Mm-hmm.
So these are widespread, but they were not the only ones. These are the ones that became more prominent. But there are others who have been in early history, and there are others that have survived up until this day. For example, the Ibadiyya, that is known in Oman.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these are looking forward and looking back to the early practice of the Muslims.
I believe
now,
Salafis refer to a hadith, right? There's a hadith that says like the first 3 generations are the best, or should be followed. And I believe the schools of thought that you're mentioning were developed after those generations.
Actually, within, because if it depends how you interpret the hadith. The hadith says, "Khairul quruni qarni, thumma alladhina yalunhum, thumma alladhina yalunhum." The best of generations is my generation,
mm-hmm.
and then that which follows them, and then that which follows them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, qarn in Arabic could mean broadly 100 years, or it could mean a generation, like the lifespan of a people.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it like one generation? In which case, it would be the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And then the generation that follows them, which would be those who came into contact with them according to Muslim definitions, and they were Muslims, and then following them as well, the next generation. So the technical terms for them would be Sahaba, and then Tabi'i, the one who follows the Sahaba, and then the Tabi'a Tabi'i, the follower of the follower of the Sahaba, right? So these schools go back to this early period. At least Abu Hanifa is said to be a tabi'i, the follower of the follower, and some might even want to classify him as a tabi'i as well. But this is more doubtful.
Mm-hmm. But the school of thought developed afterwards, right?
Yeah, the school of thought developed
it took some time to
afterwards.
develop.
But then, if you take a more broad definition of qarn, meaning 100 years. Then this all developed in the first 300 years of Islam. So within that first 300 years of Islam, all of these developments have been encapsulated in various writings, in books of Islamic jurisprudence, in books of biography of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in books of commentary on the Quran. So what emerged among Muslims almost widespread is to look back to the earlier generations.
So all Muslims do that then?
All Muslims in a way do that. You can have some modern movements that say we want to break free of all of that, but generally the Muslims are content with looking back to the earliest generations. Now, there was a man by the name of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in Saudi Arabia who lived from the year 1703 to 1792, so in the 18th century. He developed a movement in which he was emphasizing following the Salaf, and he made a pact with the ruling house of Saud in Saudi Arabia at the time. It will come to be known as Saudi Arabia from the name of the House of Saud. But his pact with them was almost like, you run the government and I will look after the religious dictates. And the two will be almost separate but, symbiotically related. So that movement became very well entrenched in Saudi Arabia. And that comes to be known to a large extent as the Salafi movement today. And now that Salafi movement then, in its particular modern shape, is quite recent.
Because Wahhabism and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he lived in the 18th century.
Yes.
And Salafism developed in, I believe, the 20th century. So that's quite a leap as a movement,
Yes, and part of the reason for that is that the establishment of the University of Medina, in which the students were being schooled from all around the globe, and they were schooled in that particular ideology of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and other thinkers besides him as well. As I said, Salafi, the idea of following the Salaf, this is widespread among Muslims. But it received a particular emphasis under the teachings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and others like him. And eventually that became the teaching that was delivered in the University of Medina and that students took to many parts of the world. So we noticed within the last 50 years or so, in the 1970s and onwards, students coming out of the University of Medina taking these teachings to various parts of the world and popularizing it, and this is what is known.
And I believe
the
Saudi government also was funding organizations in North America as well.
Yes, and this was partly in the interest of the stability of their government, because the major strand within that Salafi movement teaches that so long as the government is establishing prayers, you respect the government and you do not seek to undermine the government. And if you have any advice for them, you advise them privately, but there should be no public criticism of the government. So this was well suited to the interests of that government. So naturally, they funded this kind of movement. So Dr.
Shabir, maybe we can talk about what are the defining features of Salafism in terms of its thinking and ideology?
Well, the questioner asked about the beliefs of that movement. Well, much is similar to other movements within the Islamic world. I mean, there have been others as well, such as Hassan al-Banna and the Jamaat Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that looked back to the Salaf. They wanted to recover the way of the Salaf. They wanted the pure and original early Islam. But of course, people might interpret differently what is meant by that early Islam. But what is known as the Salafi movement today, following this, the teachings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and others, they stress a lot the purity of the faith. They want to make sure that we are worshiping God and only God. So they're stressing monotheism, which is of course common to all Muslims, but they put a particular stress on it. And so they are thoroughly against the veneration of saints, and by extension, creating like mausoleums and places where the saints might be remembered and venerated. Their movement was marked with the demolition of many sites that other Muslims considered to be sacred. So a lot of Muslims had a harsh reaction to this and reacted with scorn to this whole movement. Some of the teachings within the movement are very literalistic, so they tend to take things very literally. whether it's a report in a hadith that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said or did something, they would try to follow that as a practice literally and assiduously. In terms of verses of the Quran speaking about God, they would take the verses, they tend to take them fairly literally. So, for example, if a verse of the Quran mentions the hand of God, some Muslims would have said in history, and they did say, that this does not literally mean a hand of God, it's referring to power. And if it's where the Quran says that God ascends the throne, we wouldn't think of that as, the way a human being goes and rides on a saddle or something like this. But some of the interpreters that are followed within that Salafi movement took these things literally and thought of God as, having literally something like a human body and sitting on a throne like a human king might sit on a throne and something like this. But some others are careful to point out that we should affirm the literal wording, but we should affirm the exact wording of the ancient pronouncements on these matters, but we should not think when we mention hand of God that we're thinking of a hand. We should not think of a hand like our hand. We should say we don't know. Bila kaif. We express these beliefs or these statements of faith without knowing how it could be so. So we mentioned the hand, but we don't know what kind of hand. We mentioned that God ascended the throne, but we say we don't know what sort of ascension that would entail. Whereas somebody else might say, no, it only means that God controlled the throne. But the Salafi would tend to say, no, let's say that God ascended the throne, but let's add bila kaif without specifying how.
So, Dr. Shabir, I want to continue the discussion a little bit and ask you about the notion of bid'ah. So this idea was popularized by Salafis. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And also I want you to talk about their relationship with the schools of thought.
Yeah, so all Muslims and the four schools of Islamic jurisprudence stress the importance of following the Sunnah, or the methodology of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his practices, and so on. Some more than others. Now, the Salafi movement stresses that a lot. That becomes like the hallmark. We're following the Sunnah. And the contradistinction to Sunnah is Biddah, which means some new thing. Technically, the word means something new. But linguistically, it means something new. But as a technical term within Islamic discourse, it is used to mean something that is invented and made part of the religion, and it wasn't there before. So this is seen to be contrary to following the Sunnah, because if you're following the Sunnah, there's nothing new for you to do. You just do the same old thing. If you're doing something new, that means you're not following the Sunnah. Instead of doing what the Sunnah would have required of you, you're doing something new and different. So bid'ah, or something new, so innovation, is shunned and highly criticized within that movement. So students who came back from the University of Medina in the 1970s and later, they went around to the various mosques, they saw what people were doing, and they started to identify, okay, this is new, that's new, that's new. This is all to go away.
Yes, and people who didn't accept what they were doing, they would sometimes refer to them harshly, right?
Yes.
And sometimes they would even call people like, this is like a kafir, or I don't really know what exactly, but like they would say that you're going against Islam, you're not following Islam in the right way.
Yes, and in the Indo-Pak subcontinent in particular, people began to refer to these persons as Wahhabis, giving them a kind of derogatory sort of title, a diminutive title, to express that kind of scorn, to treat this as something outside of the religion. So it's not sometimes something outside of the religion. It actually overlaps with, you mentioned about the four schools. So it overlaps with the four schools, because but while people within the Salafi movement would be looking back to the early generations of Muslims, they will be citing the eponyms of the four schools of Islamic jurisprudence and what they said, and they would incorporate all of that into their thinking.
But I believe they look at the Hadith. They think the Hadith is paramount, right?
Yeah.
And then they have their own scholars, which they refer to, right? And who they hold very dear, who they rely on to interpret these Hadith, and then to come up with rulings on the basis of those hadith.
Yes. And not only to interpret, but also to evaluate the genuineness of the hadith. So most notable among such scholars was Sheikh Nasiruddin al-Albani, who took hadiths literally. And he is the most well-known among those who will authenticate the hadith. That's a term for it, meaning that he will take a hadith either in Sahih al-Bukhari or one of the classical books of hadith collections, And then he would weigh them one by one, looking into the chains of narrators. And because he followed that literalistic type of way of thinking, a hadith which may not make sense to us in scientific terms, he might tend to treat that as being authentic, so long as he can see that there is a known chain of narrators who are respected persons in our history who have transmitted this hadith from one person to another without break. And so that movement tends to follow these hadiths, which may not be very scientific and which may have this kind of stamp of authenticity from their known scholars. And then the hadiths will be further interpreted within that literalistic school, which does not does not subject the narratives to much scrutiny in terms of reason, and would just follow them literally. And of course, in modern times, the school has taken a hit because some of the 9/11
Salafism has taken
yes,
a hit.
Salafism has taken a hit because some of the 9/11 hijackers are thought to have belonged to that movement and following.
Of course, many Salafis are also quietists, so they don't, as you mentioned earlier.
Yes. So that's another. Many are quietists, and many would be opposed to, committing acts of violence against other people.
So, Dr. Shabir, what's your final evaluation of the Salafi movement? Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? How do you feel about it?
Well, there's good and bad in all of the various movements, good and bad in all of the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence, good and bad in various followings within the Muslim community on a whole, good and bad within the Salafi movement in particular. I read their books, I study, and I take what is good, and I leave off what is bad. On the internet today, we have sites which are run by people of that particular strand of thinking. I refer to some of these sites sometimes. I study their fatwas and their rulings. I see where they get their information from. And a lot of times, if I want to find a hadith, I go to a particular Salafi site, which I know will definitely mention the hadith on a subject, if the hadith exists. And not only that, but they will give us some evaluation of the hadith. So I'll see how the hadith is evaluated from the particular lens of the Salafi movement. But of course, I will draw my own conclusions at the end, and sometimes my conclusions will align with theirs. But in any case, I learn from a wide variety of movements. And I think Muslims should generally keep a sort of open mind and take what is good from the various movements, combine the best of all the worlds. And if we do that, we emerge as better persons, and as a community of faith, we emerge as a better community that is tolerant, that is understanding and respectful of variation and diversity within our broader movement and even outside of the Islamic community.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome. On behalf of Let the Quran Speak, I want to say thank you for supporting us. Please continue to support us this Ramadan. May God bless you and your loved ones with the very best always, and may you draw ever closer to God this Ramadan.